It's so fine, it's sunshine. If I needed someone, I'm looking through you. Where did you go? La 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 la. To say about the things that you do. Wait till I come back to your side. In my life, I've loved them all. Michelle, my velvet girl. We can work it out.
Welcome back to Pop Goes the 60s. I'm Matt Williamson. I am continuing my Beatles album reviews. This time we are on Rubber Soul. Now this album is the second album in a row where the Beatles' backs were up against a wall to complete an album on a tight deadline. With help, it was the film they had to get it done for. And in this case, with Rubber Soul, they had to get it out in time for Christmas of 1965. So Help was released in August, about the same time the Beatles started their US tour. And it was essentially a stadium tour, which was the first of its kind. So in September, when the Beatles returned home to England, they took some time off. They went home and visited Liverpool. They frequented some clubs and some shows. And in Ringo's case, he was home with Maureen, who just gave birth to their first son, Zach. Having drawn inspiration from listening to all the American radio on their recent tour, I think the Beatles were eager to get back to work and keep up with the competition that they were hearing. Now, the Beatles were probably the most competitive band on the planet, and '65 was a watershed year for pop music. You had Dylan going electric, you had the Byrds with folk rock, you have the Stones coming of age, and Motown was turning out more number ones than even the Beatles were. So Help and Yesterday were the consecutive number one songs August through October of '65, and that was keeping the fans busy. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the Beatles were going to work on what was to become Rubber Soul. Brian Epstein really understood the value of getting an album out for Christmas, and for the first time in the Beatles' career, he basically cleared their schedule so they could complete this project. So they roughly had 2 months to get this thing written, recorded, and in the can into the record plant. And with some minor exceptions, the Beatles' schedule was free to do this. As we know, John and Paul always were writing, and they were writing on the road while on their American tour. Unfortunately, they didn't come back with a whole ton of songs. That tour was only about a month long, so they didn't have a ton of songs. And when they returned to London, John and Paul had regular writing sessions at John's house in Weybridge, and recording officially began for Rubber Soul on October 12th. For 4 straight weeks, the Beatles concentrated on completing the album in time for the Christmas deadline, and Lennon and McCartney initially came up with 12 songs for the album, 7 of which were written in 1 week.
Baby, you can drive my car, and you won't see me. You won't see. Say the word and be like me.
3 songs I just played illustrate the black influence on this album, which perhaps is what instigated the title, Rubber Soul. Now, Drive My Car was influenced by Otis Redding. You Won't See Me, the chord progression of that song is the same it's the same old song by the Four Tops. And The Word, which is kind of some early psychedelia, was influenced by Wilson Pickett. Now, the thing about these 3 songs also is, for rock songs, the lyrics are more sophisticated than what the Beatles had been doing prior to this.
Should I say she once had me? There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed.
I grouped these 4 songs together because they fall under the type of music I'm going to call Exotica. Obviously, we have the sitar. We all know about how that was added to Norwegian wood. Harrison tuned it to Western notes and played it more like a guitar, really, but it took the song to a new level that had not been heard before in pop music. Actually, as far as sitars go in pop music, we heard it on the Help soundtrack. The first to actually use it were the Yardbirds earlier in the year with Heart Full of Soul, but that sounded weak, and they got rid of that, and that was replaced by Jeff Beck's searing guitar. So the sitar makes its really first appearance in a pop song here with Norwegian Wood. Now the next song, Girl, the guitar in there, the acoustic guitar, sounds a little bit Greek, like a bouzouki. So I thought that was rather interesting. The song Michelle, we've got some French lyrics, kind of an old concept Lennon and McCartney had, more of a kind of a comedy or joke to do these French lyrics, but it was turned into a serious love song. And finally, In My Life, which this song probably took the longest to write out of any song on the album, we have this wonderful piano solo that sounds, as John Lennon wanted, to sound like Bach. So it's referred to as this Elizabethan-style piano solo.
He's a real nowhere man, sitting in his nowhere land. I'm looking through you, you're not the same. Well, I'd rather see you dead, little girl, and to be with another man.
That last group of songs started with Nowhere Man, and here we have another John Lennon introspective downer song that somehow seems uplifting at the same time, thanks to George Harrison's guitar solo and the three-part harmonies. Now, I'm Looking Through You is what I would consider one of the strings of kind of anti-love songs they started to write. This one's about, presumably, Paul McCartney's longtime love interest, Jane Asher. And Run for Your Life is a kind of a throwaway song, but I always found it to be a fun song, and I don't take it too seriously, despite what some people may say.
If I needed someone, think for yourself, 'cause I will be there with you.
Those two songs were George Harrison's offerings for this album, and clearly he is making some huge steps forward in his songwriting. And those two songs aren't as melodically as beautiful as, say, Michelle or In My Life. He is progressing very quickly.
If your heart's strong, hold on, I won't delay. Tell me why, what goes on?
Now, two other songs that were done, the song Wait, that had already been recorded during the Help sessions. And for the life of me, I have no idea why they didn't include that on the Help album to displace one of those dismal covers, but it was left over, so it goes on Rubber Soul. And finally, we had What Goes On. That was, obviously they were desperate. They pulled out this one song that they had tried in 1963 and couldn't complete. And this was the Ringo track that essentially made it the 14th track of the album. So that gives us 12 Lennon and McCartney songs and 2 Harrison songs. Now these 2 songs were the single. Those were songs 15 and 16, We Can Work It Out, and Day Tripper, the double A-sided single, released in conjunction with the album. Now, Day Tripper was more the Motown influence, like some of the songs we heard on the album, while We Can Work It Out is another one of those love songs with McCartney having a problem with his old lady, Jane Asher. What's going on, Jane? Come on. Not keeping her man happy, obviously. Big, huge hit of a single. Now, in the States, where they always release more singles, the single that was released there after We Can Work It Out and Day Tripper was Nowhere Man. I think made for a great single. And that hit number 3 in the States, number 1 in Australia, and number 1 in Canada. So it was a huge hit. And the B-side, they stuck What Goes On the B-side there in the States. And that, as you might expect, charted poorly at number 83. So we see in America this kind of infatuation with pushing Ringo the movie star and putting him on the B-side of this single in the States, when the perfect B-side probably would have been If I Needed Someone. If anybody needed a deserved B-side, it was George Harrison at this point. And If I Needed Someone was a minor hit for the Hollies in the UK, charting at number 20. So it did have hit potential. In addition to Nowhere Man, the single Michelle and Backed with Girl was released in different parts of the world, hitting number 1 in 5 European countries. So that song, Michelle, also in the States was a big, kind of an album radio hit, where it became Song of the Year, winning a Grammy in 1966. Now, one other song was recorded but unreleased, and that was the instrumental 12-bar original, which never would have fit on Rubber Soul with those other great songs anyway. So with this 2 months to get this album completed, I'm surprised there wasn't more filler on this album. But it just goes to show you how strong the songs were and what they were really capable of doing at this point of their career. This album is known for introducing many new sounds in the Beatles' music. And I mentioned the sitar earlier, and that clearly was a big step forward to use that as an integral part of a pop song. The other instrument they used was the harmonium. That was pretty prominent. Paul McCartney started using a solid body Rickenbacker bass. And this is important because he started to get a better tone and a fuller sound. And he started to overdub his bass. This is where he began his great melodic bass playing period. And part of that had to do with upgrading to the Rickenbacker. The piano solo on In My Life also gives it that Bach flavor that was more classical. So this is a direct continuation of what was started with Yesterday. So the Beatles were kind of priming the world for this Rubber Soul sound, I believe, with Yesterday. And I think they really did it without overdoing it, because there really is no orchestral overdubbing on this album at all. Now, the other thing that they did that was, I think, beautiful is, as I mentioned, the three-part harmony. So we have several three-part harmonies on this album, and I think, to me, that's one of the best sounds that the Beatles can make. Overall, this album offers a much different mood than the prior work. It's more introspective, it's just more adult sounding. And there's miscommunication in the lyrics. There are literary characters being introduced like Nowhere Man. That becomes something the Beatles do very often. And I would say that this album is really sounds more like, or more influenced by Motown and the Byrds than it is Dylan. I think the Dylan comparison has been overblown. I think the Beatles are completely finding themselves as writers on this album, independent of Dylan. One of the reasons the Beatles were able to record this album so quickly and efficiently is this is the first album that employed George Martin as an independent producer. He had just co-founded Air Studios, which stood for Associated Independent Recording. And this was one of the first projects Martin did. And this allowed the Beatles for the first time to start recording late in the evening into the early hours of the morning. And I think they liked that. I think the building was very empty. I think they liked being by themselves. And I think there were just far less restrictions than with the EMI staff that they were used to prior to this album. Let's talk a little bit about the critical response to this album. Now, as we know, retroactive criticism is glowing. It's all high praise of this album, but originally some critics were unsure of this album. For example, Melody Maker found the Beatles' new sound, quote, a little subdued, and said the tracks such as You Won't See Me and Nowhere Man almost get monotonous, an unlike Beatle feature if ever there was one. Now, going forward to 2009, Neil McCormick of the Daily Telegraph wrote, the songs themselves are like little pop vignettes where the lyrics are starting to match the quality of the melodies and arrangements. So I think he's very correct about that. The lyrics are the biggest step forward here generally, and the instrumentation is right there with it. So people noticed right away that Rubber Soul was making a big statement in terms of just the album concept altogether. There was no conceptual idea for this album. There was no theme. It was just a collection of very top-notch songs. So this changed the whole concept of pop music and the whole outlook of pop music, instead of focusing on the singles, to focus on the albums. Now, one of the things that helped out with this is that, this was the first album to make an artistic statement through the quality of its songs, but the band's popularity amongst American intellectuals also gave not only the Beatles more credibility, but pop music in general. So one of the things that happened in December of '65, that helped propel this idea of pop music becoming legitimate was a television show called The Music of Lennon and McCartney. If you get a chance to watch this, it's on YouTube. It's an excellent show of a bunch of different artists covering Beatles songs. And it's written very well. And I think as far as allowing the Beatles to act to their abilities, they really hit the mark on this TV special. One thing I'd like to add is that the artistic qualities of this album are not just found in the grooves, but in the album cover as well. So here is the very famous album cover done by photographer Robert Freeman. And you probably know the story. This was supposed to be just a straight shot, but when they were viewing the slides, the slide slipped slightly, skewing their faces. And they're like, that's what we want. So this album cover is kind of bringing in the early stages of psychedelia with this skewed cover and this very cool logo here. And the Beatles name obviously does not appear on this cover. Now the American cover, as we see, not quite identical. So this is what we call a full bleed. So that photograph covers the edges completely, whereas here we have Capital when they're cheap pasted over sticker here with the white borders. I just don't think it's nearly as impactful. And also one thing I noticed as a graphic designer, that the logos are different colors. So you have the UK logo a little more orangey, and this gets a little more tan, and then by the time you get the CD, which is here, it's green. It's like an avocado green. So basically, the reason I wanted to show the album cover and spend a little time on it, it just showed every aspect that the group was involved in was advancing. A girl that wrote into Beatles Monthly said, hey, the Beatles, they look like corpses on the cover. This is a good example of how fast the Beatles were moving, how they were outgrowing their audience and their contemporaries. And that's one of their trademarks. They were always out ahead of step of everybody else. In this case, we are leaving the little girls behind and we're picking up more adult people. Once the intellectuals start clamping on, you know it's music for adults. Okay, I guess this would be the part of the video where I discuss the differences between the US and the UK versions, but I find that topic to be one of the most boring ones in Beatledom. So basically, if you grew up with the US version, that's your preferred version. If you grew up with the UK version, that's the one you like. Let's move on. Now, the sales of this album in the United States, where it topped the Billboard chart in early January of 1966, it sold 1.2 million copies in the first 9 days. You know, this was unprecedented in the music industry for a pop album. So this was really a step forward. I think this took the record industry by surprise. And because it was a more artistic statement, this started to just change everything, and everybody's ears perked up. And it was... I think it was known that we're coming upon something special here in pop music, and certainly Brian Wilson knew that because he's always cited this album as the inspiration for Pet Sounds. Now, this album is not without flaws, and a lot of today's retrospective reviews overlook these flaws, but I would say there are a few here. Number one, we know how quickly they had to record this, so there's going to be some flaws. Now, there wasn't much overdubbing in this. There wasn't time for that. And there are a couple songs I think that typically could have used a little more sweetening. What Goes On is one of them. That to me sounds like a demo. That song is really not even worthy of the rest of the songs that are on this album. And that's a song that if I was putting this album together, I would have left that song off and kept it at 13 songs. And just much like A Hard Day's Night didn't have that Ringo song because he had tonsillitis and they couldn't record a 14th song. Unfortunately, Ringo was perfectly well for these recordings, so we got What Goes On. Now, what I'm looking through you is another song that's fraught with all kinds of mistakes and little anomalies in it that probably would have been cleaned up, or they would have redone it had they had more time. Great song, and I actually prefer the US version where they have that false start. I kind of like that. It shows that the Beatles aren't perfect, so that in a way makes it more perfect, doesn't it? Now finally, I thought that the track listing on this album was sloppy, and this was the last album that George Martin did the track listing by himself. And the Beatles took over after that. And I'm going to give George Martin some slack on this one because of the tight deadline. And he actually had to phone the track listing in to the record plant. That's how tight the deadline was. But I never would have had What Goes On be a side opener. And I never would have had Run For Your Life as the album closer. I mean, to me, to my ears, I would have had The Word be the album closer because the word is love. And I think the Beatles, if it was up to them, they would have been able to see the foreshadowing coming, and that song would have been their closer. So in closing, I think the takeaway I would say about this album is it really signified the end of Beatlemania. Yes, in 65, they became legitimate movie stars with the Help album, huge hit, huge seller. They did the stadium tours, but really 1966 would contain a flurry of activity of stuff they had already done. And it would keep them away from their natural habitat, which was the recording studio. The Beatles became a studio band without a question with this album, and really there was no going back to making films. In December of 65, they shit-canned making another film in 66. Too bad they couldn't have done the same with the stadium tours of '66, and they could have spent more time in the studio. But that's hindsight, of course. So what we were left with is one of the great albums of the '60s, the first of its kind. Rock music was never the same after that, and that is what Rubber Soul gave us. Thanks for watching.